you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This should not be about political advantage. It is about the lives of hundreds of millions of people around the globe whose lives, already fragile existences, that are made more vulnerable now by the political calculations, as we've heard of the Prime Minister and the Chancellor. That's their decision. But it is choice for them to claim this nation is now free to forge its own future while demeaning our international stature by this decision. A reputation reduced at a stroke, as is so often the case under this government, but at a time when the world would ordinarily be hoping for greater leadership as we host the G7 as well as COP26 later this year. As we've heard, the only G7 country to cut its ODA budget, while others, such as the US, Germany and France, are increasing theirs. I'm afraid cutting the ODA budget at a time when less developed nations are the most vulnerable globally to the pandemic will be seen as one of the most callous choices made by a Chancellor in our lifetime. It is telling that so many across this House concur with our former Prime Ministers of all hues. As we have heard, we're talking about humanitarian aid cut by 70%, including the funding to Yemen, considered the world's worst humanitarian crisis, cut by 60%. Life-saving water sanitation and hygiene projects in developing nations, cut by 80%. Aid going to education, which will result in 700,000 fewer girls receiving an education, according to Save the Children's own analysis, cut 40%. Funding for the Global Polio Eradication Initiative, cut 95%. On the micro scale, the small British charity Dhaka Asania Mission, UK, whose FCO grant for work in northern Bangladesh has been cut 100%. The programme was to bring basic education to some of the poorest and hardest to reach rural children in Bangladesh, whose families live and work on some of the most marginal land within the flood areas of the north of the country. But it's the government's drastic cut to overseas aid also risks damaging the world's ability to fight the next global health disaster, which in turn, in self-interest, would keep Britain safe. 3,000 UK academics and global health experts in an open letter highlighted how critical are our interdependencies across our world, that the health risks and vulnerabilities are shared globally, and so should be the solutions if we are to address the emerging health threats. Remember, just over 2% of Africans have been vaccinated, whereas more than 75% of all vaccines have been administered in just 10 countries. And the decision to cut official development assistance funding has meant that UKRI need to find savings of £120 million in allocated funds in 21-22, hitting more than 800 global challenge research funding projects. For example, Warwick Medical School's work in Africa on digital health and the introduction of remote consulting, which in response to the pandemic, clinics have been contacting patients by phone rather than offering in-person visits, new and for the first time in the continent. Or the example of Newcastle University, perhaps the hardest hit of all, its leading work on water security and resilience to climate change, on river deltas, flooding and rainwater, working with 90 partners in 20 countries, helping them and stemming migration. These projects have shown Britain at its best, responsible and reliable, but no longer due to the cuts. We're happy to see an aircraft carrier travel around the world, but at the same time cut these projects to the most deserving. Madam Deputy Speaker, perhaps most depressing was hearing from the Right Honourable Member for Halton Price and Howden, who said this is something of a political gambit to win votes.